The conference room still smelled like burnt coffee and expensive cologne when she placed her badge beside the untouched glass of water. No one moved. No one defended her. Then the CFO opened a single report file, and the entire floor seemed to stop breathing. The 27th floor of the building always felt colder than the rest of the company, not because of the air conditioning, because decisions were made there, careers ended there, fortunes appeared and disappeared there like figures on a stock chart. That morning, the glass walls of the executive conference room reflected a gray Manhattan rain. Tiny drops crawled down the windows, like nervous employees trying not to be noticed. Inside, 30 people sat around the polished black table. No one spoke. At the head of the room sat Daniel Mercer. Silver tie, sharp jawline, the kind of stare that made junior analysts rehearse sentences in elevators before speaking to him. Beside him lounged his son, Ethan Mercer, casually spinning a Mont Blanc pen between his fingers as if this were a brunch meeting instead of a quarterly exposure review involving hundreds of millions of dollars. Across from them sat Elena Voss, dark blazer, hair tied back, no dramatic makeup, no visible nerves, just a thin silver watch and a stack of neatly organized folders. The kind of person people underestimated because she never raised her voice, which was exactly why half the executives in the room feared her. The screen behind the CFO displayed numbers in glowing blue columns: energy sector exposure, European renewals, pending legal risks, and one giant account highlighted in red: $340 million. The room felt tighter every second. "Let's continue," said the CFO quietly. Elena flipped open a folder. "Before we approve the extension package, we need to address the Zurich clause issue. If the client exercises the secondary exit condition, the company absorbs." "Oh my God," Ethan interrupted, leaning back in his chair. "Do you always make everything sound like a funeral?" A few nervous chuckles scattered around the table. Elena didn't react. "The clause matters," she said calmly. Ethan smirked. "No, what matters is confidence. You lawyers and contract people love pretending every tiny risk is the end of civilization. I'm not a lawyer." "Close enough." Daniel Mercer remained silent, watching. That was the dangerous part. Elena continued. "The risk exposure is manageable only if the renewal signatures are completed before Friday." Ethan tapped the table impatiently. "Or," he said, "we stop acting terrified and push the deal through today." The CFO shifted slightly. Not comfortable, not agreeing either. Elena turned one page. "The issue isn't speed," she said. "The issue is that your revised proposal removed the protection triggers." Now several executives looked at Ethan. A tiny crack in the atmosphere. He smiled anyway. "I simplified it. You removed 6 safeguard conditions. They were slowing negotiations. They were preventing litigation." The room went still. Rain tapped softly against the windows. Ethan's jaw tightened for the first time. "You know what your problem is?" he said. "You act like you're the smartest person in every room." Elena closed the folder carefully. "No," she replied. "I act like mistakes have consequences." A sharper silence followed that one. Someone near the back pretended to check emails. Another executive suddenly became very interested in his coffee cup, because everyone in that room understood the real problem. Ethan Mercer was wrong, and everyone knew it. But saying that aloud inside his father's company was like lighting a match in a gas station. Ethan laughed once, short and cold. "You've had an attitude for months," I've had objections. There's a difference. You embarrassed me in front of the client last week. You asked for my professional opinion, and you could have delivered it privately. Elena tilted her head slightly. The client asked whether the revised clauses increased liability. And I answered honestly. The CFO rubbed his temple. Daniel Mercer finally spoke. His voice was low, controlled, but somehow heavier than shouting. Elena, she looked at him, you will apologize to my son. The sentence landed like a dropped glass. Several people froze completely. Outside, lightning flashed faintly beyond the clouds. Elena blinked once, not shocked, just measuring the room. For what, exactly? She asked. Ethan leaned forward immediately. For undermining executive leadership. You mean disagreeing with you. For disrespect. The CEO's expression hardened. You crossed a line. Elena looked around the table. 30 executives. 30 silent faces. Not one willing to touch the grenade sitting in the middle of the room. That was corporate culture in its purest form. Millions of dollars. Luxury offices, designer suits. And fear wrapped in polished language. Elena folded her hands calmly. With respect, she said, the company hired me to protect contracts, not egos. A few eyes widened instantly. One manager actually inhaled sharply. Wrong sentence, wrong room, wrong audience. Daniel Mercer stood slowly. That alone changed the oxygen in the room. Apologize, he repeated. The city hummed faintly below them. Somewhere far down the avenue, a siren wailed through the rain. Elena looked directly at Ethan, then at the CEO, and suddenly something changed in her expression. Not anger, not panic, decision, clean, final, quiet. She unclipped her company badge. The small metallic sound echoed louder than it should have. Then she placed it gently on the black conference table, right beside the untouched glass of water. I won't be doing that, she said. Nobody moved. Even Ethan looked surprised now, because people threatened to quit all the time, but they usually trembled first. She didn't. Daniel Mercer's face darkened. Then get out of this building. Elena stood, smoothing the sleeve of her blazer. No dramatic speech, no tears, no slammed doors, which somehow made it worse. As she walked toward the exit, the CFO suddenly spoke. Elena. She paused. He looked like he wanted to say something important, something human. But years inside executive rooms had trained hesitation into his bloodstream. In the end, he only asked, Who finalized the Norvik renewal structures? Elena looked at him for half a second. I did. Then she walked out. The glass door closed softly behind her, and the silence that followed felt unnatural, like a skyscraper realizing one of its support beams had just disappeared. Ethan exhaled loudly. Finally. Nobody answered him. The CFO stared at the exposure report on the screen. His expression changed, slightly at first, then completely. Because at the bottom of the document, beneath layers of financial summaries and legal coding, sat a single authorization chain: primary contract controller, risk architecture supervisor, emergency override authority. Every critical section carried the same name: Elena Voss. And suddenly the rain outside no longer sounded calming. It sounded like a countdown. The silence inside the conference room thickened by the second. Not ordinary silence, the dangerous kind. The kind that appears right before markets crash, before pilots announce turbulence, before someone says, we may have a problem. The CFO stared at the screen without blinking. Then he adjusted his glasses and scrolled back up. Again, then down, again. Ethan rolled his eyes dramatically. Can we move on now? Nobody responded. That was the first sign something was wrong, because executives loved speaking, filling space, performing confidence like actors in expensive suits. But now chairs creaked nervously. Pens stopped moving. Even the rain outside seemed quieter. The CFO leaned forward slowly. Who approved removing her from the Zurich transition chain? Ethan shrugged. I did. She's gone. No, the CFO replied carefully. I mean technically. A faint pulse appeared near his jaw. Daniel Mercer crossed his arms. Explain. The CFO clicked another tab open. A wall of colored risk markers appeared across the screen. Green, amber, red. Too much red. The Norvik account isn't centralized, he said. It's layered. Ethan smirked. So Elena designed the containment structure herself. The room remained frozen. One vice president finally spoke. Meaning? The CFO inhaled once. Meaning nobody else fully manages the cross-linked obligations. Now the silence changed shape, from awkward to afraid. Ethan laughed lightly, though it sounded forced now. You're acting like she's the only employee in the company. The CFO didn't laugh. That's exactly what worries me. A soft crack of thunder rolled outside. Daniel Mercer stepped closer to the screen. What exposure are we actually talking about? The CFO clicked again. A detailed matrix appeared. European energy contracts, insurance backstops, currency hedges, penalty triggers, secondary liability chains. The numbers stacked across the display like unstable dominoes. Then everyone saw it. Projected exposure under failed renewal conditions. $340 million. Someone whispered, Jesus. Ethan straightened in his chair. Wait, that's worst-case modeling. No, the CFO said quietly. Worst case is higher. A few executives exchanged looks immediately. One woman near the far end of the table opened her laptop and began typing rapidly, fingers suddenly unsteady. Daniel Mercer's expression hardened into stone. How dependent are we? The CFO hesitated. That hesitation scared the room more than any answer. Finally, he said, Elena personally handled every major amendment negotiation for the last 18 months. Ethan scoffed, then assigned someone else. The CFO looked at him with visible disbelief. This isn't onboarding a replacement sales manager. Another click, another screen. A chain of pending approvals appeared. 37 contracts, 22 awaiting manual authorization, 7 requiring direct client confirmation, 4 marked urgent. And beside almost every line sat the same status note, pending review, EVOS. The room suddenly felt too small. One executive loosened his tie. Another reached for water with shaking fingers. Daniel Mercer spoke carefully now, every word slower than before. Can the team finalize them? The CFO answered immediately this time. No. That word landed hard, sharp, absolute. Ethan frowned. Why not? Because she never delegated the strategic clauses. That's bad management. No, the CFO replied. That's how she prevented legal exposure. A dangerous realization spread across the room. Not dramatic, not loud, just cold. Like watching floodwater rise inch by inch under a locked door. The CEO walked toward the window overlooking Manhattan. Below them, the city moved normally. Yellow taxis, umbrellas, pedestrians buying coffee. Nobody outside knew that inside the tower, a corporation worth billions had just removed the one person holding together a massive international client structure. Daniel Mercer turned back slowly. How long before this becomes visible? The CFO checked the timestamps. 22 minutes. The room stared at him. What happens in 22 minutes? Someone asked. The Asian compliance team receives the unsigned amendment status. A beat passed. Then another. And if they escalate? The vice president asked quietly. The CFO looked at the exposure estimate again. They freeze execution authority. Ethan finally stopped pretending this was funny. That won't happen. The CFO met his eyes. She warned us about this 3 weeks ago. The sentence hit like a slap. Daniel Mercer narrowed his gaze. Why wasn't I informed? Nobody answered immediately, because everyone knew the truth. The warning had been mentioned, briefly, quickly, then ignored because Ethan called it overly cautious, and nobody wanted to challenge the CEO's son twice in the same meeting cycle. Corporate fear had a smell: cold coffee, printer toner, silence. The CFO suddenly stood up. Call her. Ethan blinked. What? Call Elena. Daniel Mercer's jaw tightened. She resigned. Yes, the CFO said. And in 20 minutes we may lose operational control over a $340 million account. The words finally cracked the illusion in the room. People began moving all at once. Phones unlocked, laptops opened, assistants were texted. One executive hurried out into the hallway, whispering urgently into a headset. Panic in corporations never looked cinematic. It looked administrative, fast typing, dry mouths, forced calm. The CEO looked furious now, though it was no longer clear at whom. Ethan stood. This is ridiculous. She's replaceable. The CFO stared at him for a long moment, then asked quietly, Do you even know where the Copenhagen liability appendix is stored? Ethan opened his mouth. Nothing came out. The CFO continued. Do you know which client executive refuses unsigned digital copies? Silence. Do you know why Elena separated the Baltic risk structures from the Zurich renewals? Nothing. Not one answer. And suddenly the room saw it clearly. Ethan Mercer had authority. Elena Voss had competence, and only one of those kept companies alive. The CEO's phone buzzed. He answered immediately. Listened. Said nothing. Then lowered the phone slowly. His expression changed. Not anger anymore. Calculation. What now? Asked the CFO. Daniel Mercer looked toward the conference room door Elena had walked through less than half an hour earlier. The client is asking for her directly. Nobody spoke, because some moments expose the truth so completely that language becomes unnecessary. And for the first time that day, Daniel Mercer looked uncertain. At the far end of the room, the untouched company badge still rested on the black conference table. Small, silent, and suddenly more powerful than anyone sitting there. If you think this is where the pressure peaks, you're wrong. The next move won't happen inside the boardroom, and one phone call is about to change who really controls the company. If this story pulled you into the tension of glass towers, silent power plays, and the moment competence becomes impossible to ignore, subscribe and stay with me for the next chapter. Because the next conversation won't happen in a boardroom. It'll happen where titles suddenly stop mattering, and desperation begins talking louder than pride. The elevator doors closed behind Elena Voss with a soft metallic whisper. 27 floors above her, executives were panicking in tailored suits. Down here, in the descending silence of polished steel and mirrored walls, she finally exhaled. Not dramatically. Just once. Controlled. Measured. Like someone setting down a heavy suitcase after carrying it too long. Her reflection stared back at her from the elevator mirror. Calm face, straight posture, eyes slightly tired around the edges. Not defeated. Just finished. The lobby of Mercer Global Holdings glowed with cold luxury. Marble floors reflected chandelier light like frozen water. The security guards near the entrance straightened instinctively when they saw her walking toward the exit. One of them, an older man named Victor Hale, frowned slightly. "Everything okay upstairs?" Elena gave the smallest smile. "When is it ever?" He almost laughed. Almost. Then he noticed the missing badge clipped to her blazer. His expression changed immediately. "You leaving?" "Looks like it." Outside, Manhattan rain wrapped the streets in silver haze. Car lights stretched across wet asphalt like blurred comets. People hurried beneath umbrellas without looking up at the towers above them. Nobody on the sidewalk knew a corporate earthquake had just started 27 floors higher. Elena stepped beneath the awning and pulled out her phone. 9 missed calls already. 3 from compliance, 2 from legal, 1 from a client contact in Zurich, and 3 from unknown executive extensions. That last part almost made her laugh. Now they remembered her number. A black sedan slowed near the curb beside her. The passenger window lowered. Marcus Reed looked at her from inside the car. "Get in." Elena remained still. Rain tapped softly against the roof of the vehicle. "You sent the CFO himself?" she asked. "I came before Daniel did something even stupider." That earned half a smile. She opened the door and got inside. The warmth of the car contrasted sharply with the cold rain outside. Leather seats, dim lighting, the scent of expensive coffee, and stress. Marcus loosened his tie immediately. "That meeting was a disaster." "No," Elena said calmly. "That meeting was honesty arriving late." The driver pulled away from the curb. Traffic lights reflected across the windshield in streaks of red and gold. Marcus rubbed both hands over his face. "They're scrambling upstairs." "They should be." "You really walked out. You really stayed." A tiny silence settled between them. Not hostile, just tired. Marcus stared out the window for a moment before speaking again. "Do you know what Daniel's doing right now?" "Blaming someone else. He's trying to stop the compliance freeze." Elena looked ahead quietly. "He can't." "You sound very certain." "I built the system." The car stopped briefly at a red light. Outside, steam rose from a subway grate into the rain like the city itself was overheating. Marcus studied her carefully. "You planned for this." "No," Elena replied. "I planned for incompetence." Another silence, sharper this time. Then Marcus lowered his voice. "How bad is it, really?" Elena turned toward him, and for the first time all day, her calm expression darkened slightly. "Do you want the executive answer?" she asked. "Or the real one?" "The real one." She nodded once. "If Norvik suspends execution authority tonight, 3 secondary banking partners trigger automatic review protocols." Marcus went pale instantly. "That could spread to the insurance side." "It will." "And the media?" "Not immediately." He leaned back heavily. "Jesus." Rain hammered harder now. The city blurred outside the windows. Marcus suddenly looked older than he had an hour earlier. Not physically, strategically. Like a man realizing the map he trusted was missing half the roads. "You warned us," he muttered. Repeatedly. Daniel thought you were exaggerating. Daniel stopped listening to people years ago. Now he only listens to outcomes. Marcus looked at her carefully. And what outcome are you planning? That question lingered, because beneath the exhaustion, beneath the professionalism, there was something else now. Freedom. Small, unfamiliar, dangerous. Elena stared at the rain sliding across the glass. You know the strange thing, she said quietly. What? I'm not angry anymore. Marcus frowned slightly. You should be. I was. For a long time. Her voice remained calm, but softer now. Do you know what happens when you spend years making yourself indispensable? Marcus said nothing. Nobody notices you, she continued. They notice the machine working. Traffic began moving again. The sedan rolled through glowing intersections while the city pulsed around them. I stayed until 2 a.m, fixing exposure models nobody else understood. I canceled vacations for emergency negotiations. I protected executives who barely remembered my name. Marcus looked down. Because he remembered. That was the uncomfortable part. He remembered every late-night call she answered, every impossible deadline she absorbed, every moment leadership quietly relied on her while publicly celebrating louder people. She humiliated Ethan, they said upstairs. No, Elena had simply refused to pretend incompetence was brilliance, and corporations hated mirrors. Marcus suddenly asked, "What happens if you don't come back?" Elena looked directly at him. The answer arrived without emotion. Then by tomorrow morning, Daniel Mercer explains to shareholders why the company exposed itself to hundreds of millions in uncontrolled liability because his son wanted faster approvals. Marcus closed his eyes briefly. That sentence alone could destroy him. Not destroy, Elena corrected gently. Reveal. The car fell silent again. Then Marcus's phone rang. He checked the screen. Daniel Mercer. Of course, Marcus answered reluctantly. What? Even through the speaker, the CEO's voice sounded sharp enough to cut glass. Where are you? With Elena. A pause, then put her on. Marcus looked toward her. Elena extended her hand calmly. He gave her the phone. The city lights reflected faintly in her eyes as she lifted it to her ear. Hello, Daniel. The voice on the other end remained silent for one dangerous second too long. Then, the CEO finally spoke, and for the first time that day, his tone had changed completely. The rain intensified outside, drumming against the roof of the sedan like impatient fingers on a boardroom table. Inside the car, nobody moved. Elena Voss held the phone to her ear without speaking. On the other end, Daniel Mercer inhaled slowly. The difference in his voice was immediate. Gone was the public thunder from the conference room. Gone was the performance. Now there was only pressure, raw, heavy, controlled with effort. Elena, he said carefully, we need to resolve this professionally. Marcus Reed almost looked away. Because everybody in corporate leadership knew that sentence. It translated roughly to, we suddenly understand your value. Elena watched raindrops race down the window. I was professional this morning. A silence followed. Daniel adjusted his tone instantly. The meeting became emotional. No, Elena replied calmly, it became honest. Traffic crawled through Manhattan in glowing red lines outside the windshield. The driver kept his eyes forward, pretending not to hear a billion-dollar crisis unfolding 2 feet behind him. Daniel spoke again. Come back to the office. For what? To finish the Norvik situation. You mean save it. Another pause. Too long, too revealing. Marcus quietly rubbed his forehead. Daniel lowered his voice further. The client specifically requested you. I know. You know? They called me 8 minutes ago. That landed hard, very hard. Back on the 27th floor, executives were likely discovering a brutal reality. Relationships did not belong to logos. They belonged to people. Daniel's tone sharpened slightly. And? And I didn't answer. Marcus blinked. Even he hadn't expected that. The CEO exhaled slowly through his nose. Elena, this is not the time for games. Her expression cooled. I agree, that's why I stopped playing them. Outside, a police siren flashed blue across the rain-covered streets for half a second, washing the interior of the car in cold light. Daniel changed strategy again. Experienced executives always did. Pressure failed. Move to reason. Elena, he said quieter now, you know how important this account is. Yes. You know how many employees depend on this company. Yes. And you know the consequences if this collapses. She looked out at the city. Thousands of glowing office windows pierced the rainy evening like floating lanterns, every one of them hiding stress behind polished glass. You're asking the wrong question, Daniel. What question should I ask? For the first time since leaving the tower, Elena smiled faintly. Not warm, not cruel, just precise. You should ask why the company became this dependent on one person in the first place. That one hit deeper than shouting ever could, because Daniel Mercer knew the answer. Everyone did. Competence was expensive, but recognizing competence required humility, and humility had become rare inside executive floors. The CEO spoke after a long silence. What do you want? Marcus slowly turned toward her. There it was, the sentence every exhausted high performer secretly waits to hear. Not, calm down, not, be reasonable, not, stop overreacting. But what do you want? Helena leaned back slightly. The city lights slid across the car windows in liquid gold reflections. For starters, she said, I want Ethan removed from contract authority. Marcus nearly stopped breathing. On the phone, silence exploded. You're out of line, Daniel snapped immediately. No, Elena replied evenly. I'm finally drawing one. He's my son. He's a liability. Marcus closed his eyes briefly. Because she wasn't wrong. And that made everything worse. Daniel's voice became colder. You don't dictate executive structure. No, Elena said, but exposure reports do. Another silence. The rain softened slightly outside, though thunder still rolled faintly somewhere above the city. Daniel tried another angle. You're emotional right now. That almost made Marcus laugh, because Elena was the least emotional person either of them had ever worked with, and everyone knew it. She answered softly, If I were emotional, I would have let the contracts fail quietly. The words settled like ice water. Daniel said nothing. Marcus stared out the windshield at blurred brake lights ahead. And suddenly he realized something terrifying. Elena was no longer negotiating from fear. That changed everything. For years, she had protected the company because she believed loyalty mattered. Now she understood leverage, and people who discover leverage after years of silence become extraordinarily dangerous. Daniel finally spoke again. What else? Elena answered immediately. Independent oversight on all international risk approvals. Marcus looked at her sharply. That was enormous. You're restructuring executive authority. Daniel said. I'm protecting shareholder interests. You sound like the board. No, Elena replied calmly. The board will sound like me tomorrow morning. That sentence emptied the air inside the car, because everybody understood what it meant. If this escalated to shareholders, if compliance reports surfaced, if the exposure chain became public, the problem would stop being operational. It would become political. Inside the company, inside the board, inside Daniel Mercer's own leadership circle. And suddenly the CEO wasn't protecting his son anymore. He was protecting himself. Marcus watched Elena carefully now. For years, she had entered rooms quietly, worked quietly, fixed disasters quietly, invisible competence. But tonight she looked different, not louder, more dangerous than loud, certain. Daniel's voice returned, slower now. If I agree, you come back tonight? Elena didn't answer immediately. The sedan turned beside Bryant Park, headlights reflecting across wet pavement. People hurried beneath umbrellas, unaware that careers were shifting above them like tectonic plates. Finally, she asked, "And if I refuse?" No response. That was answer enough. Because Daniel Mercer finally understood something brutal. He no longer had the power to command her, only the ability to convince her. And men like him rarely survive that transition gracefully. Marcus's phone buzzed again. Another incoming call from the executive floor. Then another, then another. The crisis upstairs was spreading. Fast. Elena glanced briefly at the glowing screen, then back toward the rain. Calm. Silent. Thinking. And somewhere high above Manhattan, for the first time in years, Daniel Mercer was the one waiting for an answer. If you think this conversation is about money now, look closer. The next chapter changes something far more dangerous than contracts. Power itself. The sedan stopped beneath the glow of a private underground entrance 2 blocks from Mercer Global Holdings. Rainwater streamed down the concrete walls in silver lines. The city above rumbled faintly like distant machinery. Inside the car, nobody spoke for several seconds. Daniel Mercer was still waiting on the phone. Waiting. That alone felt historic. For 15 years, people had waited for him. Assistants, investors, executives, entire departments. But power shifts quietly before anyone admits they're happening. And tonight, for the first time, the silence belonged to Elena Voss. Marcus Reed watched her carefully. He suddenly remembered something she once said during a merger crisis years earlier. The most dangerous moment in business, she told him, is when the person carrying the system realizes the system needs them more than they need it. Back then, he thought it sounded philosophical. Tonight, it sounded operational. Daniel's voice crackled faintly through the phone speaker. "Elena," she finally answered. "I'm here. We are running out of time." "No," she corrected softly. "You already ran out of time. Right now you're running out of options." Marcus actually looked down after that one, because there was no defense against truth delivered calmly. The CEO exhaled sharply. "What exactly do you expect me to do?" Elena opened the car door slightly. Cold air rushed inside, carrying the smell of rain and wet asphalt. "Tell me something honestly, Daniel." A pause. Then, "Fine. When Ethan altered the Zurich protections, did you even review the revisions?" Silence. Long silence. The kind that answers everything. Marcus closed his eyes briefly. There it was. The real fracture beneath the company. Not arrogance, not bad strategy. Neglect. the slow executive disease where authority becomes performance instead of responsibility. Daniel finally answered, "I trusted my son." Elena nodded faintly to herself. That's the problem. Outside the car, headlights swept across the garage entrance in moving bands of white light. Far above them, inside the tower, compliance teams were probably flooding conference rooms with emergency printouts, while legal departments searched for solutions that should have existed weeks ago. But systems built on avoidance collapse fast, very fast. Marcus's phone vibrated again. This time he checked it immediately. Then his face changed. "Elena." She looked at him. The Zurich client copied 2 board members. Daniel's voice sharpened instantly through the speaker. "What?" Marcus kept reading. "They're requesting clarification on authority continuity." Nobody spoke, because everyone understood corporate language. Authority continuity meant, who is actually in control over there? And that question destroys companies faster than bad numbers. Daniel swore quietly under his breath. First crack, small but real. Elena stepped out of the car slowly. Rain mist drifted through the garage entrance. Her heels echoed against polished concrete while Marcus followed behind her, still holding the phone. "Where are you going?" Daniel demanded. "To think." "We don't have time for that." "You should have thought before humiliating your lead strategist in front of your executive team." Each sentence landed with surgical precision. No yelling, no drama, which made them impossible to dismiss. Marcus suddenly stopped walking. Across the garage entrance, another black vehicle had just arrived. 2 men stepped out, dark coats, corporate posture. One carried a leather folder protected carefully beneath his jacket from the rain. Marcus frowned immediately. "Elena." She turned. The older of the 2 men approached calmly. "Ms. Voss?" "Yes?" The man extended his hand. "Richard Ellison." Marcus froze completely. Even Daniel went silent on the phone, because board members did not appear in parking garages personally, not unless the fire had already reached the foundation. Ellison spoke politely. "We were hoping to speak with you before tomorrow morning." Elena's expression barely changed, but Marcus saw it. The tiny shift behind her eyes. Calculation, fast, precise, dangerous. Daniel's voice suddenly cut through the speaker again. "Richard is there?" Ellison glanced toward the phone. "Yes, Daniel." The CEO's tone tightened instantly. "You should be upstairs." "I was," Ellison replied, "until I reviewed the exposure chain." Cold silence flooded the garage. Rain hissed outside near the entrance ramp. The second board member finally spoke. Claire Whitmore adjusted her glasses slightly while studying Elena. "You built the entire containment structure yourself?" Elena answered simply, "Yes." Claire exchanged a look with Ellison. Not surprise, recognition. The kind experience people give when they finally identify who's actually been holding the building together. Daniel spoke sharply through the phone. "This conversation can happen upstairs." Ellison's reply came calm and immediate. "No, Daniel, I think this conversation happens exactly where we are." Marcus felt tension crawl up his spine, because the balance of power was moving now, not subtly anymore, openly, dangerously. Elena folded her arms lightly. "What exactly do you want from me?" Ellison answered without hesitation. "The truth." Simple words, heavy ones. For years, Mercer Global had operated through polished presentations, executive confidence, strategic optimism. Now the board wanted truth, and truth was expensive. Claire opened the leather folder carefully. Inside were printed exposure summaries covered in highlighted notes. "We reviewed your archived warnings," she said quietly. Marcus looked stunned. Archived warnings, plural, meaning Elena hadn't warned them once. She'd warned them repeatedly, documented it, protected herself. Daniel's voice became colder. "This is becoming inappropriate." "No," Claire replied calmly. "What's inappropriate is discovering that a $340 million exposure chain depended almost entirely on one executive, while leadership ignored her risk reports." That one pierced straight through the last illusion in the room. Marcus actually looked away. Because now the conversation wasn't about Elena anymore. It was about accountability. And accountability terrified powerful people more than failure ever did. Rain thundered harder outside. Somewhere above the city skyline, lightning flashed white against the clouds. Ellison stepped closer to Elena. "If you walk away tonight," he said quietly, "this company enters a crisis by market open." Elena held his gaze. "And if I stay?" Claire answered this time. "Everything changes." The garage fell silent. Not empty silence. Transformational silence. The kind that appears exactly one moment before history turns. Marcus suddenly realized something enormous. This stopped being a negotiation the second the board arrived. Now it was succession, authority, control. And standing in the middle of it all, rainlight reflecting softly across her face, was the woman they told to apologize less than an hour earlier. Ellison extended the folder toward her. "Ms. Voss," he said carefully, "we would like to discuss the future of Mercer Global Holdings." And somewhere 27 floors above them, Daniel Mercer finally understood the most dangerous truth in corporate power. The person you humiliate today may become the person deciding your future tomorrow.